So I headed down with my colleague Dennis Moynihan, who I wrote Breaking the Sound Barrier with. And we got into St. Michael's, and I was saying, oh my God, I don't even know where the Secretary of Defense lives. So I saw this organic coffee shop ahead of me, and I thought, oh, they'll tell the truth. So we went inside, and they said, what would you like? And I said, I'd like to know where Defense Secretary Rumsfeld lives. And so they said, oh, you just go out back, you drive down the road, you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. You make a right and another right, and that's Mount Misery Road. Go down that road, and that's where he lives. So, oh my God. Okay, so we drove down the road. We didn't go down Mount Pleasant Road. We took a right and then another right. It seemed like we couldn't go right enough. And we hit Mount Misery Road, and we went down the road, and then we saw the black-tinted windows of the SUV, and no, that was Secret Service. We had arrived. So I quickly got out, and I took out my camera, and I was zooming in as they were zooming out. And I was thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld know the significance of this place? But sure enough, there was a stake in the ground right next to the driveway that said Mount Misery. And so we headed off to a black church. It was Sunday morning, an ancient black church, and older folks were in the sanctuary just about to have Mass. And I went up to this woman. I said, I just wanted to ask you about this, the just historic nature of this place. Here was Frederick Douglass born here. He was tortured at Mount Misery by Covey. Now, Mount Misery is owned by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who's known for torture. And I was just wondering if you could comment on this. And she looked at me and she said, we're in church. I can't comment right now. So I was telling the story upstate New York, and a young woman student came up to me after the talk from Mount Misery to Mount Hope. And she said, would you come with me to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York, the next morning? She said, I'd like to show you Frederick Douglass's tombstone. And it was the middle of a huge snowstorm. I was flying out to Denver the next morning. I said, I guess if you meet me at 5 a.m, we could go to the tombstone. She said she'd be there. Covered in snow she was. And we trudged through the snow and wiped these snowflakes off of Frederick Douglass's tombstone. Truly amazing. And then she asked if I'd walk with her across the cemetery. She wanted to show me one more tombstone. I said, I'm going to miss my flight. She said, please. So we slid across the cemetery. And there was a tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist, the great feminist. And you know that Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies. They were friends. And when I told the story at another talk, a woman said, and did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house? Because right next to her house is a statue, not of a general, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, Susan B. Anthony was not just a feminist and a suffragist. She also was a great supporter of the abolition movement. And Frederick Douglass was not only the greatest abolitionist ever, but he was also a great feminist. He actually seconded the resolution at the Seneca Falls Women's Convention in 1848 for women to have the right to vote, which we didn't get for many, many, many decades from then. Yes, the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, these are the movements that have made our country great. These are the movements that we learn from today. I mean, when you look at the protest movement in Tunisia, then in Egypt, it wasn't just in the Middle East, it was in the Midwest as well. It inspired so many people to rise up in Madison, Wisconsin. I mean, you know that there was a place we broadcast from Madison, and there's this pizza parlor called Ian's Pizza, and they had to shut down to regular street traffic because they were taking orders from people all over the world to be sent into the Capitol Rotunda to feed the protesters who were sleeping overnight. Do you know how many orders they got from Egyptians to support the Madison protesters? I met a guy who was holding a sign who's a young Iraq vet, a U.S. soldier. He was holding a sign. He said, I left Iraq and ended up in Egypt. He was in Madison. It was amazing to see the inspiration that was going around the world. But Madison, Wisconsin, just to talk about what is historic, talking about the civil rights movement. 1932, it's where AFSCME was founded, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, which is so much under attack now with these Republican governors throughout the United States to break public unions. It was founded in Wisconsin in 1932. now under tremendous assault by a governor who was elected with the support of the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, whose father, Fred Koch, is the co-founder of the John Birch Society. John Birch Society, this racist organization that fought Dr. King, fought the civil rights movement, fought for segregation forever in the United States. And the same language that was used against the civil rights movement and King, far and outside agitators, it's what's being used today. When every time you have a governor taking on these public unions, they'll say, it's agitators from outside the state. And John Birch Society is alive and well in Wisconsin. It's based in Appleton, Wisconsin. Here are the Koch brothers, who not only funded Governor Walker, but they're the major funders of the Tea Party movement in the United States. They're the major funders of a movement whose members the Koch brothers would never have tea with. It's so important to follow the money. But these movements, AFSCME, and how it was founded. Let's not forget why Dr. Martin Luther King died in Memphis in 1968. You know why he was in Memphis. He was there to stand with the sanitation workers who were founding their own AFSCME Local 1733, who were standing, walking down the streets of Memphis, holding signs, I am a man, I am a man. Dr. King knew how dangerous it was simply to stand up for the right for people to organize. I mean, Dr. King was taking on the lightning rod issues of the day. People's right to organize, to live with dignity, and he was taking on the war in Vietnam. 1 year to the day before he was killed. On April 4th, 1968, he was assassinated in Memphis, but in April 4th, 1967, he gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York, not far from where we broadcast from. And that was the speech he gave, the Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam speech, not as famous as the Mountaintop Address, not as famous as I Have a Dream, but an absolutely critical address where he talked about the war in Vietnam. His inner circle said, don't give this speech. It wasn't only everyone else. They said, you have the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, on your side. You've gotten him to sign the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Don't alienate him. This is not your war. And he said, if I care about brown and black babies at home, I care about them abroad. And he stood up in front of this church of thousands of people, and he said, the country I love, my country, the United States, is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth today. He was slammed by the major papers of the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine. They were calling it demagogic slander, demagogic propaganda, that he sounded like he was reading a script from Radio Hanoi. But he would not stop until he was felled by an assassin's bullet on April 4th, 1968. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the abolition movement. And you know how Dr. King got his start. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She won't get up for a white passenger, and she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. 5 days later, December 5th, she ends up in court. The Montgomery Improvement Association has their meeting to elect a leader to lead the Montgomery bus boycott to end segregated transportation in the United States, and they choose as their leader a young minister who just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. And you know, Rosa Parks had sat down on the bus before December 1st, 1955, has had a number of young women and refused to get up. But this was the magic moment. And you never know when that magic moment will come. But if you're involved in social change, if you're involved in building a foundation, you will help to determine history when that moment comes. To show how brave Rosa Parks was, just go back a few months before in 1955 to Emmett Till, a young African-American boy who was 14 years old, lived in Chicago with his mom, Mamie Till. She sends him to Mississippi to be with family, to get out of the city for the summer, and he is lynched. He's dragged out of bed where he's sleeping at his aunt and uncle and cousin's house, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he had wolf whistled at a white woman. He was 14 years old. This was the summer of 1955. When his body was dredged back and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, did something very brave. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands passed by Emmett's casket and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of our country. Mamie Till did something very brave. She had something to teach the media of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Show the reality of what's on the ground. And then people will care and do something about it. I wanted to end with a young blogger in Egypt named Karim Amr. He was imprisoned for 4 years simply for blogging in Egypt, blogging the truth. And when he was released, well, the uprising took place, and he was in Tahrir with everyone else. And then he disappeared again. And when Sharif was there, I was texting him and saying, what happened to Karim? Because we all heard that he had disappeared on the Sunday night before Mubarak fell. He ended up in a desert jail. But when I was doing the column for that week, we were looking at his blog, at his website. And it was dedicated to Hans and Sophie Scholl. And some of you might know, and this is where I'll end, with Hans and Sophie Scholl, who they are. They were a brother and sister in Germany in World War II. And they started the White Rose Collective. They were not Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they thought, well, we'll get out information so the Germans will never be able to say we didn't know. And so they published a series of pamphlets together with their professors and some other workers, 6 pamphlets in all. And on the 4th pamphlet was written across the top, "We will not be silent." They would coordinate to have these pamphlets dropped throughout Germany, in an alleyway somewhere, in a marketplace, in a schoolyard, anywhere to get the information out. Well, Hans and Sophie Scholl were captured by the Nazis. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!